When I slipped in the bathroom and fell hard against the tile, the first thing I felt wasn't pain, it was humiliation. Not because of the bruise spreading on my thigh or the sting in my ankle, but because I couldn't get up on my own. I sat there, drenched and shivering, staring at the steam-covered mirror, realizing how far from independent I had become. I had to call someone. My husband wasn't home, he was on the road again, always traveling, always away. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called his nephew. His voice on the other end was casual, concerned, too familiar. He arrived an hour later with his usual easy confidence, unaware that he was stepping into a moment that would change everything. As he helped me up, holding my bare, trembling arm with unexpected gentleness, I felt something stir deep inside. Not lust. Not yet. But a pulse. A reminder. I wish I could say I stopped it all right there, that I pushed away the thought before it ever formed. But the truth is, it had started long before that fall. This was just the moment it became real. Before I tell you what happened after that day, after that first touch, let me ask you something. Have you ever crossed a line without realizing it, until it was far too late? Write in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever made a choice so small, it didn't seem like a choice at all, until it ruined everything? The bruise on my thigh bloomed like a shadow of my own carelessness, but it wasn't the injury that stayed with me, it was the silence that followed. After I hung up with the doctor, after the painkillers kicked in, I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the numbness to reach something deeper than my ankle. He hadn't even noticed. My husband, I mean. I'd called him that morning before he boarded his flight, told him I'd slipped and probably sprained something, and he'd answered with a clipped "Be careful." No questions. No concern, not really. Just the dry efficiency of a man who had checked out long ago. He used to be warm. I remember that version of him. He'd rub my feet after long days, bring flowers on Tuesdays for no reason at all. Now he sent emojis. Red heart when I said I missed him. Thumbs up when I reminded him to take his vitamins. We lived in parallel lines now, orbiting around the same address but never quite intersecting. The house felt too big in his absence. I limped from room to room, dragging my injury behind me like proof that I still existed. When I reached for the top shelf in the kitchen and realized I couldn't balance on one foot, a flare of frustration surged through me. I hated feeling helpless. I hated more that I had no one to ask for help. That's when I thought of him. His nephew. Younger by a decade and a half, always eager to please. He'd helped around the house before, trimming hedges, fixing the garage door. Polite, respectful, warm. Not family by blood, but close enough that I never questioned it. Until now. I hesitated before calling. Told myself it was practical. Just a small favor. Nothing more. He answered on the second ring, voice bright. Hey. Everything okay? I explained the situation, tried to keep it light, but something in my tone must have pierced through because he offered to come by immediately. I should have said no. But I didn't. By the time he knocked on the door, I'd changed clothes 3 times. Settled on a loose sweater and leggings that hid the swelling but still clung to my shape. I told myself it was about comfort. I knew that was a lie. When I opened the door, his smile was as easy as ever. You're limping, he said gently, stepping inside. I fell in the shower, I admitted, brushing my hair behind my ear. Couldn't reach the shampoo. Lost my balance. He winced sympathetically. Do you need to go to the hospital? No. I already saw a doctor. Just a sprain. He nodded. What can I help with? I led him through the hallway slowly, pointing out small things. The shelves I couldn't reach, the light bulb in the laundry room, the kitchen stool that needed fixing. He moved with ease, fixing, adjusting, lifting, while I hovered close, watching more than I needed to. It wasn't until he followed me into the bathroom that I noticed the air had shifted. "I was trying to get this bar installed," I said, pointing at the loose metal rod meant to be a support handle. Slipped while reaching for it. He crouched, inspecting it. "It's not stable at all. You could have really gotten hurt." His tone had changed. Protective. Frustrated, even. I felt a twinge of something I didn't expect, an emotion too soft and too sharp to name. He stood and turned to face me. We were close. Too close. "Don't do that," he said. "Do what?" "Act like it's nothing. You could have broken something." I swallowed. "It's fine. I'm fine." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're not." The silence that followed felt different than the usual quiet in this house. This wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of something unspoken blooming between us. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "Sorry. Didn't mean to get intense." I shook my head. "It's okay. Thank you for coming." His eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than they should have. "Any time." After he left, I walked back to the bathroom and looked at the support bar again. It still hung crookedly, halfway fixed. A metaphor, maybe, for something I hadn't admitted yet. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about his hands, rough from tools, but gentle when he'd touched the towel I'd dropped. Thinking about the way he looked at me, not like a broken thing that needed fixing, but like something still whole. Still wanted. I hated that I liked it. My husband called just before midnight. The signal was bad, I could barely hear him. "How's the ankle?" "It's okay," I said. I managed. He was quiet. Then, "Good. I'll be home in a few days." "Okay. Love you." "You too." We hung up, and I stared at the phone long after the screen went black. In the silence, my heart echoed louder than it should have. Not from guilt. Not yet. The next morning felt too quiet, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. I moved slower, not just because of the ache in my ankle, but because I didn't want to see him again, not so soon. And yet I found myself standing in the hallway, listening for sounds I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. He arrived before I was ready. A gentle knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts, and before I could compose myself, I opened it. There he stood, same confident posture, same easy smile, holding a small bag from the corner store. "I brought coffee," he said simply, lifting it like an offering. I stepped aside, letting him in. The house felt smaller with him in it. Or maybe I just felt too visible. Every breath I took felt like it might give me away. He moved to the kitchen, humming quietly as he set down the bag. I watched him without meaning to, noting how he moved like he belonged there. Comfortable, familiar, too familiar. I hated how easily he blended in. He poured us both coffee without asking how I took mine. He remembered. It was a small thing, and it shouldn't have mattered. But it did. I thanked him and took the cup with both hands, more to keep them busy than anything else. We stood in silence, the kind that comes when too much lingers beneath the surface. Finally, I broke it. I was thinking of installing a new support bar in the bathroom. Something sturdier. He looked at me, concern flickering across his face. "You didn't fall again, did you?" "No," I said quickly. I keep thinking about what could have happened." He nodded slowly. "Want me to take a look at it?" There was no reason to say yes. The injury was minor. I could have waited for my husband. But I nodded anyway. He followed me down the hallway, his footsteps steady behind mine. I hated how aware I was of his presence, how my skin seemed to recognize him before my mind did. The bathroom was still damp from my earlier shower. Steam clung to the mirror, blurring the reflection I didn't want to see anyway. He stepped in behind me, examining the wall where the old bar hung, barely secured. He ran his fingers along the tile, testing its give. "This was never going to hold," he murmured. I stood just behind him, not quite in the doorway, not quite out of reach. I told myself to step away, to give him space. I didn't. He turned slightly, brushing his hand along the side of the wall as he looked back at me. "Do you have a towel? I'll need to wipe this down before reattaching anything." I moved to the cabinet, bending slightly to reach inside. As I stood and turned, my ankle wobbled more than I expected. I gasped, stumbling, and before I could fall, his hands caught my arms. The towel dropped to the floor. My breath hitched as I looked up at him, his face far too close, his eyes searching mine for something neither of us could name. His hands remained steady on my arms, firm but not forceful. Time didn't stop, it simply narrowed. Everything outside that small space faded, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the ache in my chest that I couldn't ignore anymore. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We kissed. I don't remember who moved first. I don't know how long it lasted. I only remember the feeling, sharp, electric, dangerous. When I pulled away, it was as if I'd resurfaced from underwater, gasping for air I didn't know I'd lost. I looked at him, panic blooming in my chest. I can't, this was a mistake. He stepped back immediately, hands raised, expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean." "Just go," I whispered, not looking at him. "Please." He hesitated for a second, then nodded and stepped past me, out of the bathroom, down the hall, and out the door. The moment the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor. My ankle throbbed, but I barely felt it. I wrapped my arms around myself, pressing my forehead to my knees, trying to slow my breathing. It wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was. I had told myself I was stronger. That even if something stirred, I would never act on it. But something about that morning, the coffee, the quiet concern in his voice, the way he held me without hesitation, broke through the wall I'd spent years building. And now? Now I was sitting on cold tile, heart pounding in my ears, wondering what came next. The silence felt louder than ever. Later that evening, I avoided mirrors. I avoided my phone. I avoided thinking. But as I passed the table in the hallway, I noticed a small paper bag with my name scribbled on the side. He'd left the coffee. He'd left a second cup, just for me. And despite everything, I drank it. Because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if watching the paint lines could explain how I'd let things get so far. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, the closeness of his face, the tension in his shoulders just before I crossed a line I'd promised myself I never would. The worst part wasn't that it happened. The worst part was that I hadn't wanted to stop it. When morning finally came, it brought no clarity. The light felt too bright, like it was exposing something I hadn't covered properly. I showered in silence, ignoring the half-attached bar that still hung there like a crooked reminder. I avoided the mirror. My reflection no longer felt like mine. I dressed quickly, loose jeans, a plain sweater. No makeup. No earrings. I didn't want to look like someone trying. I didn't even want to look like someone who noticed how she looked. I wanted to disappear into the background of my own life for at least a few hours. The doorbell rang while I was finishing my tea. I froze, mug halfway to my lips. 1,000 thoughts sprinted through my head in the span of a second. Maybe it was a delivery. Maybe it was the neighbor. Maybe it was him. It was him. I opened the door and found him standing there with a paper bag in his hands and uncertainty clouding his face. His eyes didn't scan me like yesterday, they stayed fixed on mine. "I got you something from the pharmacy," he said, holding up the bag. "For the swelling." I hesitated before taking it. "You didn't have to." He shrugged. "I wanted to." We stood there, the weight of yesterday hanging between us like smoke. I stepped aside to let him in, though part of me screamed to close the door and pretend none of it had happened. He walked inside carefully, his usual casual energy dimmed. We didn't talk about it. Not immediately. I set the bag on the counter and opened it. Pain relief gel, bandages, a new ankle brace, and, of all things, a small bottle of eucalyptus lotion. I turned to him, eyebrows raised. He gave a sheepish smile. "You always said you liked the smell." Thought it might help. It did help, but not in the way he meant. It grounded me. Reminded me that once, he had just been family. Just a helpful young man with good intentions and an easy smile. Not this complication. "Do you want coffee?" I asked. "Sure." I moved slowly, still limping, but less from the sprain and more from the heaviness in my chest. He sat at the kitchen table, watching me like he didn't know whether to speak or stay silent. I preferred the silence. Once the coffee was poured and we were seated, he cleared his throat. "Look, about yesterday." I held up my hand. "Don't." He stopped. Waited. "I know what you want to say. And I know I should say it first. It was wrong. It was confusing. It can't happen again." He nodded, slowly, as if every word hit something inside him. "I didn't plan it." Neither did I. Silence again. This time more brittle. He started, then stopped. "I don't want things to be weird now." I gave a dry laugh. "They're already weird." He smiled, faintly. "Fair enough." We didn't speak for a while after that. He sipped his coffee. I stared at the wall, pretending I didn't feel his presence in every corner of the room. Eventually, he stood. "I'll fix the bar in the bathroom. Then I'll head out." I nodded. "Okay." He disappeared down the hall. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping my mug like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. From the bathroom came the sound of tools, metal tapping against tile, a drill whining softly. Normal sounds. Familiar sounds. They hurt more than silence. When he returned, his hands were dusty, but his expression was careful. "It's done. Secure this time." "Thanks," I said, barely above a whisper. He hesitated in the doorway, then turned to leave. I didn't walk him out. I stood by the sink long after the sound of his car faded. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, letting the moments stretch until they felt meaningless. Later that day, I tried to busy myself, folding laundry, wiping counters that were already clean, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing. Anything to stay moving. Anything to not sit still. But by evening, the weight settled back in. I sat alone on the couch, a book open in my lap, unread. The television was off. My phone buzzed a few times, messages from friends or reminders from apps I didn't care about. I picked up my phone and opened a text thread with my husband. Our last message was short, flight was delayed. I'll be back in a few days. No heart. No warmth. I started typing, "I miss you." Then deleted it. I tried again, "Can we talk when you get back?" Deleted. Eventually I set the phone down and leaned my head back, staring at the ceiling once more. What scared me most wasn't what had happened. It was that I didn't know how I felt about it. Regret, yes. Guilt, of course. But under that, deeper, more disturbing, something else. A spark I hadn't felt in years. A sense of being seen, touched, noticed. Not by my husband. Not by strangers. But by someone who looked at me like I wasn't just a fixture in this house. Like I was still someone worth leaning toward. I hated that I missed it. I hated that I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't stopped it. And I hated that I already knew the answer. The following days unfolded like they were made of glass, fragile, silent, dangerous to touch too hard. I moved carefully through them, not because of my ankle anymore, but because the air around me felt full of invisible wires I was afraid to trip. Everything was too still. I woke up early that morning, before the light had fully reached the house, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dimness. The sheets beside me were smooth, untouched. My husband's absence had never felt so pronounced. The bed was quieter without his late-night turning or early morning phone alarms. And yet, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. I moved to the kitchen out of habit, not hunger. My movements were automatic: open the cupboard, boil water, stare at the calendar on the wall that marked days without meaning. I noticed the date circled in blue ink, his return. Still 3 days away. Just 3. But suddenly, that felt like too long. Or not long enough. As I poured hot water over the tea bag, my hand trembled slightly. I set the kettle down with more force than I intended, the sharp clang echoing in the room. I needed to get out. I hadn't left the house in days, hadn't driven anywhere since the fall, and the walls were beginning to press in. The ache in my ankle had dulled to a manageable throb, and the brace held well enough. There was no real reason not to try. So I dressed, something light, a long tunic and flat shoes, and grabbed my keys before I could second-guess myself. The car smelled faintly of lavender from the air freshener I'd tucked inside months ago. I rolled the windows down halfway, letting the breeze slap away the tension clinging to my skin. I didn't have a destination. I just drove. Past the familiar streets, past the grocery store where I used to run into neighbors I no longer spoke to, past the small bakery that still had paper signs taped to the windows. Everything looked the same. I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Eventually I stopped at a small park on the edge of town. It was mostly empty, just a man jogging and a couple sitting far off on a bench, their conversation muffled by the wind. I found a spot under a wide tree and sat down, letting the silence surround me. It was strange, being alone in a public place again. Not quite invisible, but not seen either. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the leaves shift above me. They moved freely, without effort. I envied that. Time passed without shape. When I stood again, my legs were stiff, but I felt slightly lighter. As if I'd exhaled something I hadn't known I was holding. I drove home slowly, stopping once to buy fresh fruit and again just to sit in the car, watching people come and go from a cafe. It was both comforting and painful, how unaware the world was of what I carried inside. Back at home, I found the house still as I'd left it, clean, quiet, suspended. I placed the fruit on the counter and leaned against it, staring at the empty living room. The clock ticked too loudly. I almost didn't hear the knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant. I froze. Then another knock followed, and I moved toward it, heart rising into my throat like it had done before. When I opened the door, it was him. He looked different somehow. Not physically, but in energy. More cautious. Or maybe it was me who had changed. "I didn't want to text," he said. Wasn't sure if I should come. I stepped aside, the gesture automatic. He entered slowly, not with his usual stride, but with the carefulness of someone stepping into something they might break. We didn't talk right away. He followed me to the kitchen and saw the fruit on the counter. You went out? I nodded. Just needed some air. He gave a faint smile. That's good. The silence that followed was not hostile, but thick. We were both balancing on the edge of something undefined. I came to return the screwdriver, he said, lifting the small tool from his jacket pocket. I borrowed it when I fixed the bar. I reached out to take it, our fingers brushing. My hand recoiled slightly, too quickly, and he noticed. His mouth tightened, but he said nothing. I don't want to make this harder, he added. You're not, I lied. He nodded, not believing me. Okay. He turned, then paused in the hallway. You know, I keep thinking about that day. Not just the mistake, all of it. The way you looked at me before it even happened. I looked up sharply. I'm not trying to make excuses, he said quickly. I saw something in your eyes. And I think you saw it too. I didn't respond. I couldn't. He didn't press. He simply walked to the door, opened it, then turned back. I won't come again unless you ask me to. I gave the smallest nod, and then he was gone. I stood there for a long time after the door closed. Not crying. Not shaking. Just absorbing. He had seen it. The flicker. The weakness. The hunger. Whatever it was, he had recognized it. And that frightened me more than the kiss itself. Because it meant it wasn't just a moment. It was a reflection. Of something inside me. Something I couldn't unsee. That evening, the air in the house seemed heavier, as if everything was absorbing my tension. I moved through the room slowly, turning off unnecessary lights, wiping already clean surfaces, rearranging cushions on the couch only to return them to their original positions. I wasn't trying to tidy. I was trying to avoid myself. I couldn't stop replaying his words. I saw something in your eyes. He had been right. I hated that he'd seen it. Hated even more that I had ignored it for so long. I went to the kitchen, peeled one of the oranges I'd bought earlier, and stood at the counter, eating it slice by slice like it might distract me from the way my hands trembled. The tang of citrus lingered on my tongue, but it didn't taste fresh. It tasted like guilt trying to masquerade as normalcy. As I reached for a napkin, I knocked over the empty coffee mug he'd used days ago. It clattered onto the floor but didn't break. I stared at it for a few seconds before picking it up and setting it in the sink. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. It wasn't grief. It wasn't regret. It was more complicated than both. I heard a car door shut outside, and for a brief second, my breath caught. But when I peeked through the window, it was only a neighbor. I wasn't sure if I felt relieved or disappointed. The sun dipped below the horizon slowly, lazily, as if it too didn't know how to end the day. I turned on a lamp in the living room and sank onto the couch, curling one leg beneath me, the brace still stiff around my ankle. The injury had faded to an ache, but I kept the brace on longer than necessary. A small punishment. A physical reminder. I glanced at my phone. No new messages. None from my husband, none from him. Silence from both sides, and somehow that felt louder than any conversation could have been. As the shadows stretched across the room, I closed my eyes. I wasn't trying to nap. I just didn't want to look at anything anymore. The sound of the doorbell made me jump. I sat up too fast, the sudden motion sending a jolt through my ankle. I hissed under my breath but moved quickly to the door anyway. My hand hesitated on the knob. When I opened it, he was standing there again. No tools. No coffee. Just him. I shouldn't be here, he said before I could speak. I stepped back without answering. He entered quietly, his expression unreadable, his posture careful. We stood facing each other in the hallway, neither of us sure what to say. I kept thinking about what I said earlier, he began, his voice low. About seeing something in your eyes. I didn't mean it as blame. I know, I said softly. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things worse. You didn't make them worse, I replied, surprising myself with the honesty. They were already broken. I just didn't notice until you showed up. He looked at me like he was trying to figure out what that meant. I've been trying to pretend for so long, I continued. Pretending I was happy. That I didn't need anything more. And now, he asked. I don't know, I said. I'm still pretending. He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. I brought something, he added, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded paper towel. When he opened it, inside was a small sandwich, cut neatly in half. I figured you hadn't eaten, he said, holding it out. I stared at it for a moment, then took it. It was simple. Humble. But it made my throat tighten more than any grand gesture ever could. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence between us calmer this time. I took a bite, chewing slowly, grateful for something to do with my hands. After a while, he asked, when is he coming back? 2 days, I replied, not meeting his eyes. He nodded. And you'll tell him? I hesitated. Tell him what? That I kissed someone? That I let someone in because I couldn't remember the last time I felt alive? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I looked down at the sandwich again, at the clean cut through the middle, at how careful he'd been. It was almost insulting, how something so considerate could make me feel worse. You should go, I said finally. He didn't move. We kissed. The words came out flat, tired. That's what it was. One moment. That's all. He still didn't move. Please, I added. Just for tonight. He stood slowly, placed his hand gently on the table, then pulled it back without touching anything. I watched him walk to the door, open it, and pause. If you ever need me, he said, for anything. I'm still here. I didn't respond. I couldn't. When the door closed behind him, I sat there, staring at the half-eaten sandwich. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I wanted to feel relieved, but the emptiness was heavier than ever. I wrapped the rest of the sandwich, set it in the fridge, and turned off the light. Alone again. And this time, it felt like the choice had been mine. The following morning started before the sun. I woke up with the kind of heaviness that had nothing to do with sleep. The house was dark, but I didn't reach for the lamp. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator through the walls, the occasional creak in the pipes. My thoughts had no shape, only movement, circling around the same questions, the same regrets, the same hollow longing I couldn't seem to fill. I got out of bed slowly. The air felt cool against my skin, and the floor beneath my feet reminded me of how real it all was. I wrapped myself in my robe and made my way to the kitchen. It was still early enough that even the birds hadn't started their morning chatter. I boiled water and stood at the window, watching the sky shift from black to deep blue. The garden was barely visible, a shadow of itself in the dimness. The kitchen smelled faintly of citrus and dust. I hadn't spoken a word out loud since the night before. After pouring my tea, I sat at the table, cradling the mug between my palms. The silence wasn't peaceful, it pressed down on me, made my shoulders sink, made the walls seem like they were leaning in. I wanted to open a window, let something in. But I didn't. I kept thinking about how calm he had looked when he left. Not happy. Not angry. Just calm, like someone who had already accepted the end of something. It should have made things easier. But it didn't. I wasn't used to people letting go gently. I wasn't used to choices that came without noise or consequence. That made it worse somehow. Because now there was no fight, no blame to push against. Just me. Just the truth. Just silence. Later that morning, I showered and dressed without really thinking about it. The ankle brace was no longer necessary, but I put it on anyway. It felt like armor. Or maybe a reminder of how all this began, how a simple moment of weakness could change everything. Around 10, I decided to take care of the laundry. I moved slowly, not out of pain but reluctance. Every room felt like a memory waiting to be tripped over. I sorted the clothes into neat piles, breathing in the scent of detergent, something so ordinary it almost felt sacred. I needed that, something that didn't demand emotion. Just movement. Just rhythm. When I reached for the hamper in the hallway, I noticed something tucked behind it. One of his t-shirts. Not folded. Not clean. Just left behind. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. It smelled like his cologne, light, barely there, but unmistakable. My fingers tightened around the fabric before I even realized I was holding it too tightly. I brought it closer, not because I wanted to, but because my body moved on instinct. I closed my eyes. And then I heard the knock. I froze. The shirt was still in my hands as I stepped back into the main hallway. Another knock, this time firmer. My heart thudded once, hard. I placed the shirt on the nearest chair, smoothing it out without really thinking. Then I opened the door. He was there. Again. This time, he looked more unsure. Like he'd hesitated before even getting out of his car. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders slightly raised. I know I said I wouldn't come, he said, his voice low, but I forgot something. My jacket. I nodded slowly. It's in the laundry room. He didn't step inside right away. I moved first, walked down the hall, and retrieved the jacket from where it hung on the chair. When I turned back, he was still at the doorway. I handed it to him without meeting his eyes. He took it, hesitated, then spoke. I didn't expect to see you. I gave a faint smile that didn't reach anywhere near my eyes. It's still my house. He nodded. Right. We stood there, unsure of who was supposed to leave first. The silence wasn't tense, it was something else. Tired. Stretched too thin. I should go, he said. I stepped aside, thinking that would be the end of it. But before he could step out, I heard another sound, the soft buzz of my phone on the counter behind me. I turned to glance at it. A message. From my husband. I didn't read it. I didn't want to. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, I said, too quickly. He studied my face. Not probing. Just observing. I don't regret it, he said quietly. I looked at him then. I do. He didn't flinch. I know. We stood there for a beat longer, and then he gave me a small nod, respectful, distant, and stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him, final and soft. I didn't move for a while. Eventually, I picked up the shirt from the chair and folded it, slowly, methodically. I placed it in the hallway cabinet where no one would find it. Not because I needed to keep it, but because I couldn't throw it away. I walked back to the kitchen. The phone screen had gone dark. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I returned to the laundry, to the folding, to the scent of clean fabric and the hum of the machine. I let the sound fill the house, drown out the memory of his voice, of the way he looked at me like I was someone who could still change her mind. I knew better now. Some things weren't meant to be decided in silence. They were decided in moments. In reactions. In the way your hand lingers on someone's shoulder a second too long. In the way you fold a shirt that shouldn't have been left behind in the first place. I went back to folding, one shirt after another, and told myself I was moving forward. Even if it didn't feel like it. The house felt different that evening, as if it were holding its breath. I moved through the room slowly, noticing the quiet in a way I hadn't before. Not just the absence of voices or footsteps, but a kind of emptiness I hadn't been prepared for. Every surface seemed too clean, every corner too still. I was alone with my thoughts again, and they weren't being kind. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I turned off the kitchen light and walked to the living room. The sky outside was deepening into indigo, and I could see the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. I pulled the curtains closed, not because I was cold, but because I didn't want to be seen. There was something final in the way he left earlier. No lingering glances. No hesitation. Just a quiet departure that left nothing behind except the folded shirt I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I sat on the couch, pulling a blanket over my legs. My body was tired, but my mind felt too alert, too tangled. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting the seconds with indifferent precision. I stared at it for a while, letting the rhythm anchor me to something real. Eventually, I got up and moved toward the hallway. I paused by the small cabinet where I had tucked away his shirt. I opened the drawer slowly, looking down at the neatly folded fabric. My fingers hovered above it but didn't touch. I closed the drawer again. In the bedroom, the silence followed me like a shadow. I changed into something more comfortable, brushed my hair without looking in the mirror, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. My face looked unfamiliar in the glass, blurred, distant, like someone I used to be. I heard the garage door. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then came the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel, followed by the creak of the gate. My heart stilled, then quickened in a single confused motion. I stood up, moving to the window, and parted the curtain just enough to see. His car. My husband. He was home. Not tomorrow. Not the day after. Tonight. I stepped back from the window, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to check the house, make sure everything looked normal, but I forced myself to stop. There was nothing to hide. At least, nothing he would see. The damage wasn't in the objects around me, it was in me. I heard the front door open, keys jingling as they dropped into the ceramic bowl by the entrance. His familiar footsteps followed, slower than usual. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing slightly. "I'm here," I replied from the hallway, my voice even, controlled. He appeared around the corner a moment later, suitcase in one hand, expression neutral. He looked tired. His hair was slightly out of place, and the collar of his shirt was wrinkled. "You weren't expecting me," he said, setting the suitcase down. "I wasn't. They rescheduled my meetings. I figured I'd surprise you." I nodded. "You did." He looked at me for a long moment, then stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture more of routine than affection. "How's the ankle?" "Better," I said. "It's healing." "Good." He moved past me into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a bottle of water. I followed him in silence, watching as he took a sip and leaned against the counter. "How was it here?" he asked. "Quiet." He looked around. Looks like you kept things in order. I tried. He nodded, then glanced at his phone. I need to make one quick call. Then we can catch up. Okay. He left the room, and I stood there, gripping the edge of the countertop, trying to breathe slowly. I wanted to feel something, relief, maybe, or familiarity. But all I felt was the sharp contrast between who I had been before he left and who I was now. I walked into the living room and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. I stared at the spot where we had once sat together in the early years, legs touching, laughter easy. That version of us felt distant now, like something I had imagined. When he returned, he sat in the armchair across from me. He looked relaxed, comfortable. He smiled faintly. I missed you, he said. I forced a smile back. You too. He began telling me about his trip, about meetings that ran long, dinners that felt more like work, hotel beds that were too soft. I nodded where appropriate, asked a few questions, but my responses were automatic. I couldn't seem to summon genuine interest. At some point, he mentioned a colleague who had brought his wife along. They had taken a boat tour together, and he laughed, recalling how the woman had gotten seasick. I wondered if he had thought of inviting me. When he finished his story, he looked at me. You've been quiet. I'm just tired, I said. He studied me for a moment. You sure that's all? I nodded. He didn't press. Instead, he stood, stretched, and said he was going to unpack. I watched him disappear down the hallway, his footsteps familiar, steady. When the bedroom door closed behind him, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I stood slowly, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. The night had fully settled in. A few stars flickered through the haze. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. There was no going back now. Not really. He was home. But everything had changed. The morning after his unexpected return unfolded with the strange calm of denial. I moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, making coffee, slicing fruit, arranging 2 plates as if nothing had shifted inside me. My hands did what they had always done, but the rest of me, my thoughts, my breath, my sense of time, felt disconnected, like I was watching someone else perform a ritual I no longer belonged to. He walked in wearing the same shirt he had worn on the trip home. His hair was still damp from the shower, and his smile was unassuming, warm even, like he was glad to be back in a space that required little of him. He kissed the top of my head in passing, the gesture more reflex than intention, and sat down at the table, checking his phone. I placed his plate in front of him and sat across without a word. We ate in near silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the occasional comment about his travel schedule. He spoke of upcoming meetings, of budget reviews, of a colleague's irritating habit of talking through presentations. I nodded, laughed once where it felt necessary, and sipped my coffee slowly. At one point, he looked up at me. You've been quiet lately. I met his gaze for a moment too long. Have I? You seem distant, he said, not accusingly. More curious than anything else. I'm just tired, I answered, repeating the phrase that had become my shield. He nodded, accepting it too easily, then returned to his phone. After breakfast, he offered to run errands, saying something about needing to restock the pantry. I nodded, thankful for the space. As soon as the door shut behind him, I stood in the center of the kitchen and just breathed. Not deeply. Just enough to prove I still could. I wandered into the laundry room, not because anything needed doing but because I needed to move. The folded shirt was still in the cabinet. I hadn't touched it since the day I put it there. I stood staring at the drawer for what felt like a long time, then turned away. The house felt like a stranger now, like someone I had once known but no longer understood. Every corner held a memory I wasn't sure I could trust anymore. The hallway, the bathroom, the garden, each space echoed with silence I didn't know how to answer. I went outside, letting the screen door slam gently behind me. The morning sun was already warming the yard. I walked toward the edge of the garden where the lavender bushes were starting to bloom. The scent was faint but comforting. I knelt beside them and ran my hand through the soft tops, the texture grounding. I thought of the eucalyptus lotion he had brought me, still sitting unused in the bathroom cabinet. I thought of the way he had looked at me that last time, unafraid but resigned. He had left a quiet space behind him. One my husband had now filled without noticing the shift. I heard a voice across the fence, our neighbor talking on the phone, laughing at something I couldn't hear. The sound was jarring, too normal, too bright against the fragile quiet I had wrapped myself in. I returned inside after a while, not because I wanted to, but because standing outside had begun to feel like avoidance. Inside, everything was still. I checked my phone, no new messages. I didn't know whether I felt disappointed or relieved. When my husband returned, arms full of groceries, I helped him unpack. We worked side by side and practiced silence. He asked if I wanted to go out for dinner that night, just the two of us. I hesitated for a second, then agreed. Maybe part of me hoped a small piece of normalcy would stitch something back together. That evening, I stood in front of the closet longer than I should have. I tried on 3 different outfits before settling on something I hadn't worn in months, a navy blouse and dark jeans that used to make me feel confident. I added earrings, even touched up my hair, more out of obligation than desire. He complimented me when I walked into the room. "You look nice." "Thanks." The restaurant was familiar, a small Italian place we'd gone to for anniversaries. The staff remembered us, greeted us warmly. We ordered our usual dishes, and for a moment, I almost believed the illusion we were building together. Over pasta and wine, he told me stories about the people at his conference, about a new project his company might take on. I listened, asked questions, nodded at the right times. But my focus wavered. I found myself watching the other tables, the people laughing, clinking glasses, leaning in close. I studied their expressions, their gestures, wondering if any of them were pretending too. Halfway through the meal, he reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were warm, firm, familiar. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. "I missed this," he said. "Just us." I smiled, small and hollow. "Yeah." On the way home, he drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting between us. The radio played softly, an old song we used to hum together. I didn't sing along. Back at the house, he unlocked the door, held it open for me, and followed me inside. The moment we stepped into the living room, something changed. He turned to me, stood still for a second, and then reached for my hand. I let him take it. He looked at me for a long time, searching. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "You sure?" And I lied again. "Yes." We spent the night together. And I lay awake in the dark afterward, staring at the ceiling, feeling the shape of my guilt settle into something solid. Because in the quiet that followed, I knew I had made another choice. One that would not erase the first. Only complicate it. The morning crept in without apology. I lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, the sheet twisted around my waist, my arm falling asleep beneath me. The weight of the previous night pressed down like humidity in a closed room, unseen but inescapable. I could hear him breathing softly beside me, unaware, untroubled. That used to be comforting. Now it felt like distance in disguise. I slipped out of bed as gently as I could and padded down the hallway. The house was dim and quiet, just the way I liked it in the early hours. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see myself. Not yet. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and stood by the window while it boiled. The sky outside was a soft gray, thick with low clouds that promised a slow, smothering rain. I welcomed it. Let the world mirror what was happening inside me for once. The tea tasted weak, metallic, but I sipped it anyway. My body moved as if it had memorized the motions long ago, even as my thoughts churned in silence. The memory of his hands, his voice, his warmth, they tangled together with shame and confusion until I no longer knew which parts were mine. He appeared not long after, hair still tousled, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. He greeted me with a tired smile and a casual morning, like nothing had shifted between us. I answered quietly, and we moved through the routine like two people rehearsing for a role we no longer believed in. Breakfast. A discussion about errands. A kiss on the cheek. I watched him leave from the window, his car disappearing down the road, and once again, I was alone with everything I couldn't say. The house was too quiet after that. I wandered through it without purpose, touching objects I hadn't noticed in months, the edge of a picture frame, the smooth handle of the back door, the old rug near the laundry room that had started to curl at the corners. I opened the hallway cabinet and stared at the folded shirt again. I had hidden it as an act of denial, but its presence now mocked me. I reached in, picked it up, and held it against my chest. The scent was fading, but it was still there, just enough to cut through my resolve. I sat on the floor and stayed there for a long time. At some point, I moved to the garden, needing air. I stepped out barefoot, the grass cool and wet beneath my feet. The sky had begun to darken, the clouds bloated and heavy. I welcomed the weight of it all. It suited me. I walked toward the back corner of the yard where the old patio chairs sat unused. I hadn't cleaned them this season. I brushed off one and sat, tucking my legs beneath me. It was there that I heard the sound of a car engine. I looked up instinctively, but it wasn't his car. It was smaller. Familiar. My breath caught. He had parked across the street, not in front of the house, and I could see him through the windshield, sitting still, hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead. He didn't get out. He didn't have to. The moment was enough. The message was clear. He knew I was home. He knew my husband was back. And still, he had come. I stood slowly, not moving toward him, not waving, just watching. The tension in my chest grew tighter, heavier, as the rain began to fall. It started softly, tapping on the leaves, then picked up into something steadier, more insistent. He didn't move. He simply sat there in the rain, engine idling. I walked back inside without looking back. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the wood. My pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. That afternoon, I tried to clean the house, to scrub something clean that couldn't be reached by soap and water. I vacuumed rooms that didn't need it, reorganized drawers I hadn't opened in months. Still, nothing changed. Later, I prepared dinner without asking what he wanted. I made something simple, roasted vegetables and rice. The chopping, the sizzle, the fragrance, it should have felt like comfort, but it only reminded me of all the evenings I had cooked in silence, hoping someone would notice I was still trying. When he came home, he was soaked. He had forgotten an umbrella, and his jacket was dark with rain. "Did you get caught in it?" I asked. He shrugged. "Didn't look like much when I left the office." He handed me the grocery bag he had picked up and toed off his shoes. I placed the bag on the counter and didn't mention the other car. The one that had sat just out of view. The one I hadn't told him about. We ate dinner in silence. He talked a little, mostly about work, and I nodded at the right moments. I asked nothing. I gave nothing. I was already elsewhere. After dinner, he offered to do the dishes. I let him. I retreated to the living room and sat with a blanket draped over my knees. The rain was still falling, softer now, but steady. I turned off the television. I didn't want noise. Eventually, he came in and sat across from me, hands clean, expression relaxed. "I'm glad we're getting back to normal," he said. I looked at him and wanted to say that normal was gone. That it had vanished quietly while no one was paying attention. That I had changed. That I couldn't go back. But I said nothing. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, tired from the day. I watched him like a stranger. Like someone I had once known but could no longer explain. And for the first time, I realized I didn't know how this story would end. Only that it already had. And no one had noticed. Not even him. I woke up before dawn, my body restless even after sleep, my thoughts already spiraling before my feet touched the ground. The house was still quiet, wrapped in the hush that comes only in those brief moments before the world begins to stir. I stood by the window for a long time, watching as the sky shifted from deep indigo to a murky gray, the rain from the night before leaving streaks down the glass. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was swollen with everything unsaid, every emotion I had swallowed over the past days, weeks, months. The weight of pretending had become almost unbearable, and yet I still moved through the house like a woman trying not to disturb something fragile, something already cracked. My husband was still asleep. His breathing even, undisturbed by whatever storm had taken root inside me. I watched him for a moment before stepping out of the bedroom, not wanting to wake him, not ready to answer any questions I no longer had the strength to lie through. I found myself in the laundry room again, as if my body had decided where to go before my mind could. The folded shirt in the cabinet remained untouched. I stared at it for a long moment, then opened the drawer and took it out. The fabric was soft beneath my fingers, no longer holding the faint trace of his scent. Just cloth now. Just memory. I walked through the house holding it, my bare feet brushing over the cold tiles, the cotton pressed against my chest like it might explain something if I held it tightly enough. When I reached the kitchen, I set it on the counter and stared at it like it might blink or breathe. I didn't know why I kept it. I didn't know why I hadn't thrown it away the moment everything changed. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a need to hold on to proof that something had really happened, that I hadn't imagined the shift in me. When he finally stirred, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards above. I folded the shirt once more and returned it to the drawer before he came down. The door closed gently behind me, as if the house too understood the need for quiet. We had breakfast together without saying much. He commented on the weather, the forecast for the week, the need to replace one of the garden hoses. I nodded, responded in kind, and finished my toast in silence. Every word felt like a placeholder. Every glance between us was empty of curiosity. He didn't ask where my mind was. And I didn't offer it. Later, he suggested we drive into town together. Pick up a few things. Maybe get lunch. I agreed. Not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of saying no. The car ride was filled with casual music and soft conversation. He talked about work, again, his voice calm and practiced. I watched the road pass beneath us, the trees, the sidewalks, the people walking in pairs. Everything felt like a picture I'd already seen before, familiar, but distant. At the store, we walked aisle by aisle. I followed him, adding a few things to the basket, answering his questions with short replies. It all looked the same, shelves, labels, colors, but I was somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere heavier. Afterward, we had lunch at a small cafe near the park. The same cafe we used to visit when we first moved to this town. The owner still recognized us, greeted us warmly, asked how we'd been. I smiled and said we were fine. I didn't know if it was true. We ate outside, under a covered patio, while the clouds gathered again above us. The air smelled like wet earth and old wood. I watched him stir his drink absently, the same way he always did when he was thinking. He talked about repainting the guest room. I think a lighter color might make it feel more open, he said. I nodded, not really picturing it. Sure. You've been somewhere else lately, he said, more softly. Not in a bad way, just distant. I looked at him for a long time, unsure of what to say. The truth wasn't something I could hand him across a table with our coffee. I've just had a lot on my mind, I said. Anything you want to talk about? I shook my head. Not yet. He accepted that. Too easily, perhaps. Or maybe he was just used to not knowing. We finished lunch and drove home in silence. The windows fogged slightly, and he turned on the defroster. I sat with my hands in my lap, fingers woven tightly, wondering if he noticed how far away I had gone. Back at the house, we unpacked the groceries and went our separate ways, he to the garage, me to the living room. I stood by the bookshelf, running my hand across the spines of novels I hadn't opened in years. My fingers stopped at a title I barely remembered buying. I pulled it out and opened it, only to find a note tucked between the pages. Not a real note. Just a receipt. A small, folded piece of time from 3 years ago. I stared at it, trying to remember the day I had been standing in that checkout line. What I was thinking then. Who I thought I was. I left the book open and walked into the hallway. I didn't know where I was going. I passed the cabinet again. I didn't open it. Instead, I went to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. The clouds were moving fast above the house. The trees swayed gently in the wind. Across the street, everything was quiet. I sat on the front steps, arms wrapped around my knees, and just breathed. A few minutes passed before I noticed something on the porch, a single eucalyptus leaf, blown in by the wind, resting near my foot. I picked it up and held it between my fingers. The scent was faint, but there. I didn't know if it meant anything. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it did. Inside the house, I heard the door to the garage close. I stood up, brushed myself off, and walked inside. He was standing in the kitchen, holding something, an old bag of screws, rusted at the edges. You think we should finally fix the fence this weekend? He asked. I looked at him, really looked. And I realized I didn't have the answer. Maybe, I said. And I meant it. It was the only thing I could say.